He remembered the sound before he remembered being afraid of it. Decades later, sitting for an oral history project that would eventually be archived and largely forgotten, a former Luftwaffe flak battery officer described it the way a man described a sound he has spent the rest of his life trying not to hear again. Not thunder, he said, because thunder arrives and passes. This did not pass. It built. It came from the west in a low, continuous register that pressed against the chest before the eye ever found the source. And by the time the source was visible, the sky itself had changed color. He said his crew had been trained, drilled, tested. He said they had shot down aircraft before, watched them fall, felt the particular relief that comes from confirmed kills. He said none of that mattered on this particular morning, because what rose over the horizon that day was not a raid. It was a weather system made of engines. He did not name what he was describing right away. He circled it, the way people circle the center of an old wound. He talked about counting, trying to count individual aircraft and losing the count somewhere past 300, then giving up on counting altogether and simply watching, because the human mind, he said, is not built to hold a number that large and still function. What he was describing, and what this script is actually about, is the United States Army Air Force's heavy bomber campaign over Nazi-occupied Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that flew, by the war's end, in formations numbering in the hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 aircraft in a single mission. This is not the version of that story told on recruiting posters, in the reunion hall photographs of grinning young men in leather jackets, or in the triumphant newsreel montages that compress 4 years of daylight slaughter into 90 seconds of stirring music. Those versions show the result. They show victory arriving at the end, already earned, already clean. This is the version built from what the other side wrote down, in flak battery logs and fighter pilot debriefs, in the private diaries of Luftwaffe commanders who were, by any honest measure, among the most skilled airmen who ever lived, and who nonetheless found themselves, mission after mission, unable to fully explain what they were fighting. And it is also, in its final act, the story of what became of the machines themselves, because the ending of this story is not a monument. It is a scrapyard in the Arizona desert, and it is worth understanding why. Germany did not enter the air war over its own skies as an amateur. By 1940, the Luftwaffe had already fought the Spanish Civil War, the Polish campaign, the Battle of France, and the Battle of Britain. Its fighter arm had developed, through hard combat experience, a working taxonomy of enemy air forces, a rough internal ranking of who was dangerous and why. The Royal Air Force's fighter command was respected, its pilots understood to be tenacious defenders flying increasingly capable aircraft, but operating within a defensive doctrine that played, largely, to a single strength, intercepting single raids over familiar ground. Soviet aviation, in the early phase of Operation Barbarossa, was assessed, accurately in the initial months, as tactically unsophisticated and hampered by poor early warning infrastructure, though German officers who survived to 1943 and 1944 would revise that judgment considerably as Soviet doctrine matured. Against both of these adversaries, German fighter doctrine, built around concentrated firepower, disciplined formation flying, and superb ground control direction, had proven consistently effective. The mental model German commanders carried in 1942 was one of a battle-tested, technically excellent Air Force facing challengers who could be costly, but who ultimately fit within known patterns of combat. The Americans did not fit the pattern. What arrived beginning in the autumn of 1942 and escalating through 1943 was something the existing taxonomy had no clean category for. Massed, unescorted, heavily armed four-engine bombers flying in daylight, in tight defensive formations, directly into contested airspace, on a schedule that did not slow down even as losses mounted. German doctrine assumed that unsustainable loss rates would force an adversary to change strategy, shift to night bombing, as the RAF had done, or scale back operations to conserve aircraft and crews. The initial expectation among Luftwaffe planners was that American daylight raids, once they encountered serious fighter and flak opposition, would either be abandoned or forced underground into the cover of darkness within a matter of months. That expectation was wrong, and the record of exactly how it became wrong is where this story actually begins. The first cracks did not appear as dramatic revelations. They appeared as small, almost bureaucratic notations, the kind of detail an intelligence analyst writes down because it seems slightly off without yet understanding why. In the autumn of 1942, following early raids on occupied France, one Luftwaffe intelligence assessment noted that American bomber formations maintained defensive fire discipline even after sustaining what should have been formation-breaking losses, aircraft continuing to hold position, continuing to provide covering fire for neighboring bombers, even with visible battle damage. The analyst's marginal note on one such report, preserved in post-war archival study, reads simply, "Verify through additional sources. This does not match expected behavior under sustained attrition." It was the kind of note a careful officer writes when the data contradicts the doctrine and the officer is not yet willing to conclude the doctrine is wrong. By the summer of 1943, that caution had eroded. Reports from fighter wings tasked with intercepting American raids increasingly described not disorganized formations ripe for exploitation, but dense, mutually supporting boxes of aircraft whose combined defensive fire made a single-pass frontal attack, the tactic that had proven devastatingly effective against the B-17's earlier, more vulnerable variants. A genuinely dangerous proposition, even for an experienced pilot. One German wing commander's after-action commentary, summarizing several engagements that July, stated flatly that the Wehrmachts, the German slang term for the four-engine bombers, were, in his words, not behaving like bombers. For words, not behaving like bombers. It was not tactical jargon. It was closer to confusion. The mechanism behind that confusion, once German analysts and later post-war military historians reconstructed it, was not mysterious in the way the frontline pilots experienced it. It was, in fact, describable in precise doctrinal terms. The United States Army Air Forces had built its heavy bomber force around three deliberately reinforcing structural choices. The first was the combat box formation itself, developed specifically to concentrate the defensive firepower of dozens of individual bombers, each B-17G carrying up to 13 heavy machine guns, into overlapping fields of fire that made isolating a single aircraft extraordinarily costly for an attacking fighter. The second was aircraft design philosophy. Both the B-17 and B-24 were engineered with significant structural redundancy, capable of returning to base and landing with an engine destroyed, a tail section shredded, or major structural damage that would have been fatal to less robustly built aircraft, a design decision that meant crews who might otherwise have been recorded as losses instead returned, flew again, and reinforced unit cohesion and experience retention. The third, and in the assessment of post-war analysts the most decisive, was the sheer standardization and scale of the American training pipeline, a system producing bomber crews at a rate and consistency that allowed loss rates which would have permanently crippled the Luftwaffe's more artisanal, individually cultivated pilot corps to be absorbed and replaced. One post-war analysis by a former Luftwaffe operations officer described the American approach not as superior individual airmanship. German pilots, man for man, often remained more experienced in pure flying skill well into 1944, but as an industrial doctrine of sustained, replaceable mass, deliberately built to survive its own losses. It was not romantic. It was structural, and it worked. The first case study where this structural reality became unmistakable was the double raid of August 17, 1943, against the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production facility at Regensburg. 230 American B-17s launched that morning. 60 were shot down, and dozens more returned with crews killed or wounded aboard. A loss rate near 26% that, by any pre-war calculation on either side, should have ended the campaign of daylight strategic bombing outright. German fighter pilots involved in the interception described, in debriefs conducted within days of the raid, a formation that absorbed catastrophic losses without breaking apart or turning back before reaching the target. One German fighter pilot, recalling the engagement afterward, described watching a B-17 with its left outer engine trailing fire hold formation for nearly 11 minutes before finally falling away. 11 minutes in which its crew continued firing rather than bailing out early. He said it did not feel like watching an enemy retreat. It felt, in his words, like watching something refuse. A staff analyst reviewing the interception reports that week wrote a brief, almost clinical reaction in the margin of one report. Loss rate should have broken formation cohesion. It did not. Recommend reassessment of assumed collapse threshold. It was not praise. It was a professional admitting that a model had failed. The pattern escalated on October 14, 1943, a date the surviving American aircrews would come to call Black Thursday, in which the Luftwaffe, in its own internal correspondence, treated initially as a decisive victory. 291 B-17s returned to Schweinfurt that day. 60 were destroyed outright, and roughly 130 more sustained damage, a combined loss and damage rate exceeding 60% of the attacking force in a single mission. By every conventional metric of attritional warfare, this was the kind of result that ends a campaign, and for a period of several months afterward, unescorted deep-penetration daylight raids into Germany were in fact suspended while American commanders reassessed tactics and, critically, worked to field long-range fighter escort. Conventional military logic, and German assessment at the time, held that this pause was the beginning of the end of the American daylight bombing effort, an adversary absorbing an unsustainable defeat and withdrawing from an approach that had failed. A German fighter group commander's report from that period expressed confidence that the Americans had learned, at extraordinary cost, the same lesson the RAF had learned 3 years earlier, and would now shift permanently to night operations. He was not wrong that the Americans had learned something. He was wrong about what they concluded. Within 5 months, American heavy bombers returned to German skies in numbers larger than before, now accompanied by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters capable of escorting them to the target and back, an outcome the same commander, in a later report, admitted he had considered structurally implausible given the fuel and range limitations understood to constrain single-engine escort fighters at the time. The largest and most costly engagement in this progression, and the emotional center of what German airmen and flak crews would later describe as the unraveling of their entire operational confidence, came during the sustained air campaign against Berlin and the wider Reich, beginning in early 1944, once escort fighters closed what had been the bombers' one exploitable gap. By this stage, raids routinely involved 800 to over 1,000 heavy bombers in a single mission, protected end-to-end by fighter escort that increasingly outnumbered and outperformed the Luftwaffe's own dwindling, fuel-starved interceptor force. A German flak crew member stationed near Berlin during this period, in testimony recorded decades later, described a mission in March 1944 during which he watched contrail patterns stretch from horizon to horizon. Not a formation anymore, in his description, but a ceiling, a second sky laid over the real one, and said that for the first time in the war he understood, standing at his gun, that nothing he personally did that day would change anything that happened. He said the worst part was not the bombs. It was watching Luftwaffe fighters, the aircraft he had been trained to believe are the finest in the world, rise to meet the formation and simply be absorbed into it, the way a wave is absorbed into a much larger sea. A staff analyst's contemporaneous note on the escalating loss reports from that period reads, in its entirety, fighter attrition now exceeds any sustainable replacement model. Continued resistance is a political decision, not a military one. The line is dry, procedural, written by someone whose job was arithmetic, and set beside the flak crewman's memory of watching a boy he had trained with fail to return from an interception that morning. It is difficult to read that dry sentence as anything other than devastating. It was into this same period that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, made the remark that has since become one of the most frequently cited admissions of the entire air war, reportedly telling colleagues that the moment he saw American Mustang fighters escorting bombers as far as Berlin itself, he knew the war was lost. Whatever precise words passed his lips in that moment, the substance of the admission is well documented in post-war accounts of his statements. An acknowledgement from the man who had once promised that no enemy bomber would ever cross into German airspace, that the campaign he was responsible for defending had been, in the most literal operational sense, defeated in the air. The reckoning that followed the war was not conducted by propagandists. It was conducted in memoir after memoir by the men who had actually flown against the bombers and the men who had directed Germany's wartime production under their weight. Adolf Galland, who had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm for much of the war and who remained, by nearly every account, one of the most gifted fighter tacticians of his generation, wrote afterward of the strategic bombing campaign not as a story of American technological superiority in the air-to-air sense. He was consistently clear that individual German pilots and aircraft often remained highly competitive well into 1944, but as a story of an opponent who had built a system specifically engineered to keep absorbing losses that would have broken any force built the way the Luftwaffe was built. Albert Speer, who as Reich Minister of Armaments oversaw German war production and had every institutional incentive to minimize the bombing campaign's effect, wrote in his own post-war memoirs of the sustained Allied bombing of German industry, and the ball-bearing and fuel targets in particular, as having imposed damage on war production that came, in his own later assessment, dangerously close to the point of full industrial collapse well before the war's actual end. A third voice, that of a former Luftwaffe operations staff officer writing in a post-war military journal, framed the same conclusion in the driest possible terms. The German fighter arm had not lost the war in the air through any single failure of skill, courage, or tactics, but through an inability to answer a doctrine of sustained, structurally engineered mass with anything the existing force was built to sustain in return. And then the machines that had done all of this simply disappeared. Within 18 months of Germany's surrender, the same B-17s and B-24s that had flown through flak fields thick enough to darken the sky, that had absorbed 60% loss rates and kept flying, that had, in the recorded testimony of the men who fought against them, felt less like aircraft than like weather. Those same airframes began arriving by the thousands at storage and reclamation fields across the American Southwest. Kingman, Arizona, Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, Davis-Monthan and outside Tucson. There, in facilities operated by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, aircraft that had cost tens of thousands of dollars and countless hours of skilled labor to build, and that had carried crews through some of the most lethal airspace in human history, were stripped, their engines and instruments salvaged for whatever limited resale value remained, and then fed, wing sections and fuselages alike, into massive rotary smelters that reduced them to molten aluminum ingots within minutes. A worker at one such reclamation yard, interviewed years later for a regional historical project, recalled that toward the end of a shift the smelter crews stopped even glancing up when a new bomber was rolled toward the shear, that the machine, which had once been described by the men who fought it as something closer to an act of nature than an aircraft, had become, on that lot, simply tonnage. Estimates place the number of American heavy bombers scrapped in this manner in the years immediately following the war at well over 10,000. The vast majority of the entire operational fleet melted down and sold back into the domestic economy as raw aluminum stock that, according to period accounts, ended up in everything from kitchen pots and pans to the foil wrapping of chewing gum. Which brings the story back to the flak officer from the opening, and to the one detail that makes his testimony worth ending on. In his original post-war statement, the earliest recorded version of his account, given in the 1950s, he described his feeling watching that formation on the day he could never quite stop hearing as one of surrender. He used the German word that most directly translates to giving up, an admission that in that moment, facing that machine, resistance had simply become pointless. Decades later, in a later interview conducted shortly before his death, he was asked about that word again, and he corrected himself, carefully, the way old men correct themselves when they have finally had enough time to think a thing all the way through. He said giving up was the wrong word. What he had actually felt, he said, was closer to a kind of relief, not defeat, but the freedom of no longer having to pretend that skill and courage alone could answer a machine built the way that one had been built. It was not, he said, an enemy in the way he had understood the word before that morning. It was closer to a verdict. The war ended in 1945. The verdict, it turned out, was scrapped into ingots within a few years of victory. Its aluminum sold by the pound, because in the end, What actually happened to the thousands of bombers that decided a war was not a monument, or a museum, or a myth. It was a furnace, an ordinary, unremarkable fact that even the machines history remembers as unstoppable are, in the end, simply metal, waiting to be melted down into something else.